Hi everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Nori Jacobi. I'm a presidential scholar of society in neuroscience. And I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, Daphna Shohamy. She's an associate professor of psychology in Columbia University and a principal investigator in the Zuckerman Mind and Brain Behavior Institute. Dr. Shohamy research combines brain imaging in healthy humans with studies of patients with brain disorders to understand how we learn from experience, how memories are formed, and how past experience shape the way that we make decisions. So please welcome Daphna.
So I was just saying I feel a little bit like an outlier. My background is in neuroscience, co-trained with sort of cognitive psychology, so I'm what we call a cognitive neuroscientist. And the work I do here at Columbia, I have a lab with students and postdocs, and we do research on the human brain with a focus on trying to understand how the brain learns. What are the biological principles that underlie learning? And from my perspective, I really feel that the brain is a learning machine. There's nothing more important that our brain does because our environment is constantly changing. And learning is really just a term to broadly describe how our brains and minds adapt to the changing environment so that we can behave appropriately and learn from experience. And understanding how that happens at the level of neurons and circuits and regions of the brain is kind of the challenge we address. And parallel to just sort of the challenge of translating something so broad and cognitive into biological terms, there's actually a fundamental challenge even when we think about how learning, what we want learning to accomplish. And I think this kind of dovetails with some of what Pamela was speaking about, which is when we learn from experience, we want to accomplish two seemingly contradictory goals, which I think are relevant to crafts. We want to get better and better and better and skilled at something that we do over and over. We want to develop expertise in particular domains so that we can advance our craftsmanship, our ability to give talks, our ability to mentor students, have relationships, whatever it may be. But we also need to remain very flexible, creative, on our toes, cognitively speaking. And it's not clear how the brain accomplishes both things at once. And so it's this trade-off between kind of expertise and specificity of learning, getting better at one thing, while being able to be open-minded and creative and think about things differently as the context changes, which is one of the challenges that we're trying to understand. And so broadly, the answer, which is not really an answer, but our perspective on this from neuroscience really picks up from ideas that go as far back as Plato, thinking more about decision-making. There's sort of this fight between reason and emotion, which is not exactly the same, but parallel. And in more modern times is a similar idea of these sort of two systems for thinking fast and slow. This is a book published by Danny Kahneman, a psychologist who remarkably won the Nobel Prize for Economics, who really point out the idea that one solution to this tension is to have both. Of course, that's both a solution and not a solution at all, because as I'll come to at the end, what we do then is try to understand each of these systems, so to speak, leaving open the question of how does the brain and mind arbitrate between them. But what I want to tell you about today is sort of the neuroscience perspective on this dual system kind of idea. And so the basic idea is that in the architecture of the brain, there are different structures located in different regions and that have different neural properties, and that neural architecture that's different in different parts of the brain helps different parts of the brain specialize in different forms of learning. So the two parts of the brain that my work is focused on and that I think are really most relevant to this tension, the way we understand it, and that I'll be talking about today are the striatum, which is shown here in this kind of pink color on the slide. And beneath it in teal is the hippocampus. And the brief summary is that from decades of work, there are good reasons to think that the striatum, here in the pink again, is a part of the brain that's really essential for acquiring skills and habits, for learning that's incremental, that keeps updating time after time after time as we repeat a behavior, and either successfully or unsuccessfully. And in that sense, that this system, this part of the brain, the striatum, is really oriented towards actions, but in a particular way. It's really about learning how to do something, not just executing an action, but learning how to do something and getting better at that skill. The hippocampus, by contrast, we think is really specialized based on its architecture and its general role in building richer associations. So not stimulus response actions, but kind of a rich representation of memories about the world. Episodes, you go home and think back next week, something will remind you of today, and you have this sort of almost complete kind of reliving of the moment. You remember what you were wearing and who you were sitting next to and whether you were hungry or not. All of those kind of somewhat arbitrary bound together elements of a memory are thanks to your hippocampus doing its job and building these sort of memories of particular episodes. And in many ways, what's important about these memories is that they're flexible. You not only can have this retrieval of a memory later on, but you can use it now to think about what happened, to kind of deliberate and prospect, and that supports kind of higher level cognition, the way we usually define it. And many people refer to this system as being specialized for learning what, as opposed to learning how. So that's kind of, I'm starting with a summary, and now what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit about the work, a very small sample of it, that stands behind some of these conclusions. So I'm going to start with the striatum. I was going to say we can sort of feel free to jump in with any questions of clarification. I realize this is sort of a varied audience. One of the really interesting hints as to what the striatum does and why it's important for learning about actions comes from the fact that the striatum is the part of the brain that receives very, very substantial amounts of dopamine. Okay, so dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that the brain produces, and that is probably the most popular neurochemical outside of science. So many of you have probably heard of dopamine. But what you might not know is that dopamine actually is produced in a very small subset of cells, here shown very broadly as sort of this yellow circle in the midbrain. Okay, sorry, I think I should say probably this is the brain. And your eyes would be there. Do you have a pointer that by any chance? It's not crucial, but my cursor isn't working. So in the brain here this is your kind of frontal cortex. This is a brain carried this way. The eyes would be here. So this is the bottom of your head, and this is the back of your head. Okay? And so this is the striatum here in pink with the dopamine going to it. And one interesting feature about, oh, thank you very much. All right, there we go. So almost all of, really all of the dopamine in your brain, this famous neurochemical, comes from a very small subset of neurons right here in the midbrain, okay, and projects to very, very few places. The most prominent projection is to the striatum. Okay, so that's something very important dopamine does, and whatever it's doing is very important for the striatum. And that if we can understand what dopamine does, that tells us a lot about how the striatum learns actions and what its job is. And so from that perspective, there are really kind of two interesting facts. The first is that Parkinson's disease, as many of you know, is really diagnosed and considered as a motor disorder. People lose the ability to control their actions efficiently and smoothly. Notably, in Parkinson's disease, it's not that people can't move, at least early on, and that's not really a feature of the disease. It's that they can't move the way they want to. They can't kind of motivate their movements. And in fact, the main problem in Parkinson's disease is specifically a loss of these dopamine neurons here. And so by the time someone is diagnosed with this motor disorder, the main thing that's different about their brain from a healthy brain is that they've lost about 80 to 90% of the dopamine in their striatum, leading to sort of this deterioration in action control. Okay? So that's the first hint that there's something about action control and motivated actions that this system in the brain is important for. Okay. The second hint comes from things related to reward. So most of you have probably, if you've heard of dopamine, you've not heard of it in the context of Parkinson's disease. You've probably heard of it in the context of substance abuse, addiction, or in the many articles about the fact that you can't put your iPhone down has something to do with dopamine, which, by the way, there's no basis for, just to let you know. But it is true that dopamine is the neurochemical, it's the neurotransmitter that almost all drugs of abuse increase in your brain. So we know that having more dopamine in your brain, broadly speaking, seems to be related to things that feel good or are reinforcing and make you want to do something again. Now, at first glance, these two things seem very different, and for many years, these two ideas about dopamine were developed in neuroscience very much in parallel. And then there was a big discovery that helped bring together ideas about dopamine and reinforcement, reward, and pleasure, together with the idea of learning of skills or actions. And so let me tell you briefly what that discovery was. This was a discovery that was led by Wolfram Schultz, Peter Dayan, and Reed Montague, and the first came out in the late 90s. And what they were doing, you may know that neurons work by emitting electrical pulses. Okay? So what we can do in many situations is put an electrode in the brain and record the electrical pulses that neurons emit. Okay? And we can then ask questions about what are the patterns? When do neurons fire electrically and when are they silent? These scientists were recording from dopamine neurons. They were listening in, so to speak, on when the dopamine neurons are responding to things happening in the environment, and they were doing this in animals. And this is what they discovered. This is just a cartoon showing you one of their first findings, which is that if an animal is just hanging out, and the researchers unexpectedly give them a drop of orange juice, which they very much like, there was this very strong and very immediate response in the dopamine neurons. So that's shown here. So here's the reward. When it was unexpected, you see this burst of firing in dopamine neurons to this unexpected reward. You can think of this in your own life as sort of walking down the street and finding tickets, to Hamilton tonight. The next thing they discovered, so far, right, this really fits with the idea of reward and reinforcement and substance abuse. But what they discovered is that if that juice reward is reliably preceded by some kind of hint, in this case it was a tone, a sound. This is a lot like Pavlov's study. So there was a sound that every time the sound came on shortly after, the animal received this unexpected or now expected reward. With time, the dopamine neurons no longer responded to the reward itself. Okay? So Jesse, it's not really just pure pleasure. Instead, the dopamine neurons responded to this cue, the sound, that predicted the reward. Okay? So that adds a level of complexity, and it hints at something that has to do with prediction and updating. Somehow the system is learning what it is that predicts reward. And then the third thing they discovered that really kind of completes that idea is that if an animal hears a sound that it knows should be followed by the juice reward, but now the experimenters decide not to give it the expected reward, what they find is a decrease in the response in the dopamine neurons here, so that now, at the time when the reward was expected, the dopamine neurons are basically signaling, this is disappointing. I had an expectation, and now my reality is worse than I expected it to be. I expected a reward and didn't get it. So altogether, this sort of pattern of findings has been looked at in many different ways, and of course this is just an example. All this gets quantified with complicated statistics. But the basic idea was that dopamine is not pleasure itself in some kind of simple pleasure juice kind of way, but that what dopamine is signaling has to do with surprise about rewards, not the reward itself. And surprise, for people who care about learning, is really important because we know that that's really a signal that our brains should update its expectation about the world, right? Surprise is really a signal that you had a prediction, but you need to update that prediction because you were wrong. And so this signal carried by the dopamine neurons was referred to as a prediction error. The idea is that dopamine is recording an error in prediction, and that is basically a learning signal that's being sent to the striatum, which is controlling our actions, so that our actions can be better tailored to what we can expect about in terms of outcomes in the world. So I gave you sort of one example of how this plays out in animals as it first played out. Does this have anything to do with the human brain? And does this at all in any way tie into the kind of things we see in people with Parkinson's disease, for example? So this has been a question that many groups, including my own, have been interested in, to ask, do these reward prediction error signals drive learning in humans? And many people have really been thinking of how does one test cognitive skill learning. What people have been interested in is taking the cognitive part and the updating part, but leaving the action part aside so that we could see is there updating that's separate from the actions, and then kind of bring those two things back together. And so one way several of us have done this is what we do is we develop computer games that are not particularly interesting as far as computer games go, but that are designed to test learning in a particular way to test these ideas. In this case, we might ask you to come into our lab and either sit in an experimental testing room in front of your computer, or more likely we'd ask you to come in and lie in an fMRI scanner while you do this. But the kind of game we'd ask you to do is something like this. Choose between these two shapes, and if you choose the right shape, you'll get $1. Now, we do this with undergraduates, and that $1 is very exciting to them. And they make a guess, they don't know, and sometimes they win $1, and sometimes they don't. Okay. And what we do is we make this game probabilistic. We make the relationship between each of the shapes and reward noisy. And what we are doing in that sense is making sure people have to update each time. It's not enough to learn in one shot. So in this example, the blue triangle might lead to the $1 reward 70% of the time, but would lead to no reward 30% of the time. Yellow circle would be the opposite. No reward 70% of the time, reward 30% of the time. And we'd ask people to do this for 200, 300 times in a row. This is not the most interesting thing you've done. But when they do that and they're motivated, they're basically producing an action to obtain reward, and we can ask when they're wrong. If the blue triangle led to reward 4 times, but not on the 5th time, do we see changes in their striatum that correspond to that surprise signal? We're controlling the surprising outcome, and we're measuring their brain to see, does their brain track that surprise in the regions we would expect it to? So, as I mentioned, we measure this in 2 ways. We use fMRI, it's just functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is basically a very large magnet that can measure metabolic activity across the entire brain. It's non-invasive. Many of you have probably had an MRI scan for other parts of your body. It's a good imaging technique. The F in functional MRI stands for functional, which means that rather than capturing just a picture of your brain, a static picture, it's more like a video. We look at metabolic changes in your brain over time as you're learning. And so that's really revolutionized the field of cognitive neuroscience, because that allows us to look at changes in the brain as a function of thoughts and behaviors. And we also ask people with Parkinson's disease to perform this kind of computer game, and we measure how well they do. Again, this is interesting because these people have lost basically the dopamine inputs to the striatum. And here's a summary of about a decade of work. This is an image from fMRI, which you see often in the popular press as these sort of hot spots on the brain. This sort of image that you see is really sort of like, you can think of it as a graph. It's not the output of the scanner. It's the result of a lot of analyses of metabolic activity. But what it tells us here is that where you see bright colors are the parts of the brain where activity throughout these 300 trials of the task is moving with that element of surprise. Okay? And we see this nowhere else in the brain, and what I'm showing you here is another view of the striatum. This is now a slice through the brain this way. Okay? So that's the top of the brain, the bottom of the brain, and this is really right through the middle. And this is the striatum, that pink structure I showed you before, now kind of cut this way as opposed to seeing the whole thing. And the brain has two more or less symmetrical hemispheres. And what we see here is this activity both on the left and the right side of the brain, specifically in the striatum, that's tracking with this surprise element of reward in this sort of task. So that would suggest that we should also find that patients with Parkinson's disease might have abnormalities in this sort of learning, even though the action part is relatively simple. And briefly, that is what we find. So what I'm showing you here is a sample of data here showing you how healthy people do this task. On the vertical axis here, I'm just plotting, think of it as accuracy, percent correct. So if people were perfect, they'd be up here. If they were just guessing, they'd be down here. And you can see that healthy people can track the probabilities of the shapes pretty well, reasonably well. Here's what we find when we ask people with Parkinson's disease to learn this kind of simple task. They can do it, but they don't do it as well as healthy people do. And this is something we've seen very frequently. As you might see, and it says that these are Parkinson's patients that are in a low dopamine state as a consequence of the disease. But what we can also do specifically is ask, well, if dopamine is the issue here, we can test what happens when Parkinson's patients are on their regular medication, because the way to treat Parkinson's disease is give them drugs that enhance dopamine. And we can ask, if you now add dopamine, can you change their learning? And the answer, more or less in many studies, is yes. So if you now give people dopamine, which both corrects their motor behavior, you also see that it corrects this ability to kind of learn from trial and error type of learning. So we have what we term converging evidence, which is really a fundamental principle in the complicated field of cognitive neuroscience, where we're trying to understand mind in biological terms. We really want to see that we find data that fits with a story, no matter whether you're looking at patients or healthy people or animals. So here we kind of have all three kinds of studies pointing in the same direction. So far, I've told you that we think that dopamine inputs to the striatum play a key role in shaping habits and in learning skills. You can think of this as stimulus response learning. And the key thing is that it helps us develop this sort of stamped-in, automatic, and implicit type of learning. We do something over and over and over again, and our striatum, with its dopamine inputs, keeps updating the expectations over and over and over again. Okay, this is the repeated element seems to be very, very important here. And this has implications for action control in both health and disease. But that helps us understand one, I think, very kind of narrow slice of behavior, and leaves open many questions about other aspects of learning, right? We don't always have the chance to develop this kind of stamped-in habit or skill. Often we have to learn based on a single event. Something happens to you one time. You don't have a chance to update over and over, and it could be really important. And we also, even when things do repeat, they repeat in different ways. I see Pamela Smith repeatedly throughout the year, but the context changes. So if I were to learn from my interactions with Pamela in one context, they might not apply to another context. We have to be kind of nimble and flexible in our ability to apply what we learn. So this kind of flexibility and generalization, I think, is a really important piece of understanding cognition and learning. Right? So various terms that come up depending on the field or who you're talking to are things like simulations. We need to sort of simulate new events. What happens if I now see Pamela in my lab? Never happened, but it could happen. We have to be able to prospect when we have to control our behavior. When we're creating, we have to be able to sort of imagine how something will turn out, how a scenario will play out over time. One way to think of this is, there's really this need for constructive cognition. It's not just about what happened. It's about rebuilding pieces from the past to generate something new in the future. And I think this is probably related to creativity, or at least in this sort of loose definition, these are the kinds of things that are probably important for creativity. And there are people in this room who know a lot more about the kind of science specifically behind creativity than I do. And I think there are really good reasons to think that the hippocampus is important for that. So in the next several minutes, I want to give you kind of just a brief overview of what we know about the hippocampus, how it relates to this, and show you a couple examples. And the thing to keep in mind is that depending on who you talk to, people will say that what the hippocampus does is build memories. Okay? Other people will tell you that the hippocampus codes for space, spatial navigation, and other people will tell you that the hippocampus helps you cross boundaries in time and imagination. All three are true and really hint at what the hippocampus does. So I'm going to give you kind of a whirlwind tour of some of these ideas to give you a sense of things that I think are very relevant for this sort of tension between skills and creativity, potentially. The first hint comes from a really interesting case in science, maybe even more famous than dopamine, which is the case of patient HM, who was a young man with intractable epilepsy who, at age 27, underwent brain surgery. How many people here have heard of HM? Okay, not everyone. Good. Let me explain a little bit then. So HM, we now know his full name is Henry Mollison. He was referred to as HM while he was alive. Had very severe epilepsy that was not responding to drugs and was life-threatening. And a surgeon located the center of the epileptic seizures in his brain and went in and performed brain surgery to remove the epicenter of the seizures to basically save Henry's life. The seizures were centered on the hippocampus, which was a part of the brain we knew very little about at the time. Here's an image of Henry's brain. Just to show you now, you can sort of see here are the eyes, back of the head. Now I've learned to orient the brain. Here's where the hippocampus lies. And here you can see there's really just a black hole in Henry's brain where the hippocampus and nearby areas were removed. And here is now a slice this way through the brain. And again, you can see the left and the right side of the brain. These black holes here are where the hippocampus should be. Okay? So the good news from Henry's surgery was that it treated the seizures, which stopped, and that was the goal. He generally recovered his health, but he lost the ability to create new memories. And this was a surprising outcome, and it was a profound impairment. So the doctors would come in day after day, hour after hour, and he did not recognize them, and that did not go away. He completely lost the ability to create new memories of his life's events. And the kinds of memories he was no longer able to create were specific. So he could create no new memories of people, places, or moments in his life. This was termed anterograde amnesia because it's sort of forward-looking. It's the new experiences that don't get encoded. By and large, he was absolutely able to remember who he was and his childhood and his parents and things that happened before the surgery. So this captures that idea of episodic memory, sort of these rich episodes of a moment in time. That's what he lost. And what was kind of striking is that there were other aspects of learning, like skills of various sorts, that remained completely intact. So here's an example of a motor skill. This is a mirror tracing task, which is absolutely painful to have to do. When I do samples of these sorts of things in science fairs, and my kids love having me do this because it's like I'm just as bad at this as they are. And the idea is that you have to trace a shape while looking in the mirror. So you think you're moving your hand to the right, but you're moving it to the left, and you can't see your hand. You can only see the mirror image. And you have to do this over and over again. You get better at it, but it's really very difficult. So here, for example, if one of us tried to do this, this is just showing how many errors you would make if you traced a star shape for 3 days in a row, and it's showing that you start high on errors here, but you make fewer and fewer errors. You really get better at it, and it's really a great example of a skill in the sense that you have no idea what you're doing that's different over the 3 days. You just do it over and over again, and you get better, like riding a bike. So Henry can do this and could get better at this just like anyone else could. The only difference was that he didn't remember doing it before. So you'd come in for the second day and he'd say, I remember I did this yesterday. He'd bring in the test the second day for Henry and you'd ask him, have you seen this before? No. Have you seen me before? No. And yet he got better. And there are examples in the anecdotal stories of he would say, I don't know how I did that. I've never done this before. So he really had no record of the event, but the skill itself was learned. So he had a selective memory impairment. I'm shifting now to another level to ask if the hippocampus is important for memory. As neuroscientists, what we want to know is how? What are the neurons doing, right? I told you what the dopamine neurons are doing. We want to kind of listen into the neurons and say, what do these neurons do that helps them build these memories? So here's just one of my favorite examples of an image of neurons in the hippocampus to show you this is a slice through a rodent brain where the hippocampal neurons were visualized with a particular technique called brainbow, which allows us to see kind of the texture of the different neurons. The colors are not of any significance. They don't suggest different kinds of neurons. They're just useful to see the structure, because if they were all the same color, they're so overlapping, we wouldn't be able to see it. And also, I just think it's a very aesthetically pleasing image. And it shows you this sort of very nice organization of neurons in the hippocampus. So we can put electrodes in the hippocampus of animals, such as rodents, and we can listen in and ask, what are these neurons doing to help them build these memories? This is something people did, and the main thing they discovered was that these neurons seem to be building a map of space. Okay. So here's what they do. I want to show you. This is a kind of schematic. What they do is that as the rodent is navigating a maze, different neurons respond when the animal is in a different part of space, as if they have a part of space that they care about, and they're creating across these different neurons a map. So this is a neuron that I'm just color coding in blue that cares about this part of space, and then another neuron might respond in a different part of space, and another neuron in a different part of space. And so these were termed place cells, which you may have read about, and they suggest that the neurons in the hippocampus represent a spatial map. And in fact, this is such an important discovery that these three scientists, the O'Keefe and the Mosers, John O'Keefe and the Mosers, won the Nobel Prize for this discovery in 2014. And if you read the headlines on this, it said, neuroscientists discovered the GPS system in the brain. Okay? So neurons in the hippocampus represent a spatial map, and what you're probably, I want to show you one example just so you can see for yourself how this works. How am I doing with time?
I would say a few more minutes.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is let us together listen to these place cells so you can get a sense of what these data actually look like, okay? And the reason we're listening is not because neurons actually make noise, but they communicate, as I mentioned, with electrical activity. So we can record that electrical activity and amplify it and then listen to the neurons firing. Okay, so let's see if this all works. This tells me I'm giving a talk right now. Okay. So what you're going to see here is a rodent navigating a maze. Okay, and what you're going to see plotted on this side of the screen are when different neurons are firing. So you'll see that the neurons are color-coded here to help us track where the animal is and how that changes when the neurons are firing. Okay, so what that suggests, and I'm happy to share this link, there are many
Hi,
more.
I'm Paul Tchenko.
Sorry about that. Did it go away? It went away. Yeah? Can't tell. Yeah, but I think it stopped. Okay. Okay. So what you're probably thinking, and what my parents were thinking when they read about the hippocampus and the GPS system, which was not what I had been telling them the hippocampus does, is what does this have to do with memory, right? It seems like a very different way of thinking about cognition. And the answer has something to do, we think, with how neurons in the hippocampus bind information. And this is a schematic to show that the idea is that neurons in the hippocampus encode the relationship between elements of an experience. So that right now, as your hippocampus is forming a memory, it has spatial information, because that's a big part of what's happening, but it also contains information about your own thoughts, about me, about Pamela, about Columbia, so that the various elements in your mind are associated in the hippocampus in basically a network of associations. And that's something in common both for creating rich memories and for creating a kind of a map of space. What this gives us, I'm going to kind of just explain very loosely, but what this gives us is kind of this dynamic system. So if you take this schematic seriously for a moment, consider the solid lines, real things that are associated, like things in the moment. What happens is if you later see one of these elements, let's call this Pamela, sorry to pick on you, then you might associate Pamela in another context with everything that happened in this context. So you can create these sort of bridges in memory based on overlapping elements and sort of this multidimensional network of experiences that are constantly being built upon in this kind of very rich way. So this seems to have something in common, and there's some evidence for this, that linking memories to navigation, but also to imagination. Turns out that you need your hippocampus not just to remember what happened, but also to imagine things happening in the future and to simulate future events. So the idea then is that one of the things the hippocampus does is it really supports what look like different things like navigation, memory, and imagination by having this sort of common mechanism of binding elements of experience across time and space. And one of the features of that relevant to this, and this is the last thing I'm going to show you before concluding, is that when there's partial information, a bit of an idea, a thread of a pattern, if you will, that can help generate and complete out a full network of associations. And that process where some small thread can lead to full-blown kind of experience, I think is captured much better here than by many scientists. And this is just a very brief segment from the movie Ratatouille.
Locations within the arena that the rat was running around in.
Ratatouille? They must be joking.
Drama. Okay. Right, so it's this experience we've all had where something elicits this full-blown memory and kind of lead you down this kind of cognitive path, both thinking about the past, but also changing the way you might be thinking about the future. All right. So some conclusions from the work in this field are the idea that there are different learning systems. They have distinct neural architectures. They are elicited in different contexts. And they build different kinds of representations that serve our behavior in different ways. And that this might be really important for understanding how we can both execute automatic, well-learned actions while maintaining flexibility and creativity in our thoughts. Some of the open questions for the field that we're in, some that we're pursuing in my lab in particular, and this is a subset of many, many, many questions. One is, of course, this leaves open the question, if there are two, when you have two systems, how does the brain arbitrate between them? How does it integrate between them? When we say we sample a memory to think about the future, what do we really mean? What's happening in the brain? How does the information go from one place to another? I didn't touch upon this, but a very controversial, I think, important element of this story has to do with conscious awareness of memories. The textbook version says that the automatic learning happens outside of conscious awareness. The more hippocampal memories happen with conscious awareness. My own opinion, and several of my colleagues would argue, but I have your attention, is that it's not. The conscious awareness is separate from this. It is not a feature that distinguishes these forms of learning. There are, I think, really important questions about development and aging and how these different forms of learning might change early childhood through adolescence and into healthy aging and unhealthy aging. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much for your attention.
The next speaker responding to Daphna would be Suvarna Alladi. She's a professor of neurology in the National Institute of Mental Health and Neuroscience in Bangalore, India. Her group is investigating the relationship between education, use of multiple language and bilingualism, and occupation in building neural reserve. She's also interested in understanding life course of experimental factors that protect against cognitive and functional decline in aging. And she's also established one of the first cognitive disorder clinics in India, which serves over 2,000 patients with dementia and other cognitive disorders. So please welcome Professor Alladi.
Thank you very much for the introduction and a very good morning. Thank you, Daphna, for an amazing presentation. And right. So I was asked by Pamela to respond to how habits and skills are learned by Daphna, perspectives from neuroscience. I'd like to respond from a cognitive neurology perspective, a clinician's perspective about our experiences with how these habits and skills are lost in our patients with cognitive disorders. So I come from Hyderabad. We're three of us from Hyderabad. Pamela's also been in Hyderabad, so you can kind of be from Hyderabad for now. So this is a Char Minar, which is the famous Muslim old monument, which is a brilliant work of architecture. And this lady here is wearing a sari, and I don't need to introduce the sari to all of you. And this is a very famous painting by an artist, Raja Ravi Verma, from the south of India. And the floral pattern you see on the ground is what most women in India very casually and make in front of their homes as an auspicious decoration. And this is the Hyderabadi biryani. If you come to Hyderabad, you must eat it. I'm sure Uzrama will give you a standing invitation, and she has probably the best biryani in India. And it's very difficult to make. And we speak many languages, Telugu and Dakini. English is our official language, is a language in our workspaces, and Hindi is our official language. And I must confess that wearing a sari and doing a rangoli and making biryani are very complex skills. And while I can give this talk very easily, I can't really wear a sari comfortably. I cannot make a rangoli, nor can I cook biryani. They're quite complex. But these are the processes that break down when a Hyderabadi develops dementia. So this is how they present to us at the clinic. Doctors have become forgetful. You've heard from Daphna about the role of hippocampus in memory. And this is where the disease starts in Alzheimer's disease, in the hippocampus, in the medial temporal lobe, and they come to us and tell us we're forgetting things. Sometimes we have patients who come to us and say, Doctor, I can't seem to find the right word. Now, again, we heard from Daphna so nicely, different parts of the brain have different functions, and the language function is well distributed, mostly on the left side, is predominantly in the front of the brain called the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. And then you have people who can't find their way around, and they have problems with spatial navigation, and there are different parts of the brain again, and that's the back of the brain called the parietal lobe, and the hippocampus also participates in this. Or a person can come to you and say, my mother is behaving oddly. She's very disinhibited in public and she's very inappropriate. And we have something called social cognition, which allows us to behave appropriately in society with people. And when there is frontal dementia, people have this kind of behavioral abnormality. But sometimes we have patients who come to us and say they can't handle tools, they can't do things with their hands that they used to. So there was this 56-year-old lady who had problems in judging distances while she stepped up and down stairs. She had problems driving, reversing, judging distances, finding her seat properly. She couldn't locate the switch on the wall. She wouldn't place the utensils properly on the stove. She couldn't place the telephone receiver handle properly over the cradle. So this is a disease where there is, well, we use cognitive tests, simple tests to identify the disease. And this KMAT that we all can read so well, it's one of the simplest cognitive tests. It's fragmented letters. She would say, doctor, those black things, I don't get them. And she couldn't draw. This was a clock, a house, a flower. There were just some squiggles. And you can see in the scan that the yellow and the red is a normal part of the brain where it's functioning well. This is a PET scan of the brain. But the back of the brain, it's like it's an abrupt cutoff. There's no blood kind of metabolism in that part of the brain. And this is unlike typical Alzheimer's disease where they forget things. This is atypical Alzheimer's disease where they can't perform skills. So this is one kind of patient that we see. Another case as an illustration. My mother talks non-stop but does not make sense. So she was a lady from a village near Hyderabad. And she was talking very fluently about her children, about her health, and about her bodily complaints, but she had severe problems finding the right name. And we use this naming test. We give them simple pictures to name. And if you can notice in this, Avu is cow. You'll see the word repeating. The goat was cow. The giraffe was cow, camel was cow, the pig was cow, the crocodile was cow. But none of the non-living objects were cow. So this is a disease that we call, well, this was a cow, this was a man. So this is a disease called semantic dementia. Again, we saw from Daphna's talk about the black hole in HM scan. That is when it was removed surgically, but in some diseases, parts of the brain degenerate and they shrink. And in this patient, you can see that you can see on the left side, the temporal lobe. Anyway, there's a small area of the brain that's atrophied, and that area is so important for understanding concepts. Concepts about objects around us, about things around us, meaning of objects, meaning of things. So when we do the Cambridge Semantic Battery, which we take them through the different common categories, you can see the only animal she could bring out was cow. No fruits, no birds, no vehicles, no tools, but she could name 10 vegetables. So this is a very characteristic feature of semantic dementia where something you're familiar with stays in spite of disease. And then we wondered, she is a lady from a village, and this is a test, fine, she doesn't seem to be able to say much, but what is her knowledge comprising of? What is in her experience? Because she's talking so much. And then we thought, what does this lady do during the day? Quite surprised. She was able to rattle out names of gods and the names of foods that she cooked. Now, gods, we have thousands and thousands of gods in India. And each of them, we have Durga here, who's an embodiment of courage. We have a god that is an embodiment of knowledge, and then music, and then a god of obstacles. So they have very rich semantic associations. They carry very specific weapons, and they have little animals that they ride on, tigers and swans. So there's a very rich semantic knowledge that they have. And we found in her, she still had retained it in spite of fairly advanced semantic dementia. And finally, this lady was an artist. She was a professor of English literature, a poet. And she had come to us, and for 6 months she had not spoken at all, very dull, disinterested, apathetic. And this was all she would paint, black blotches. We heard again from Daphna about connecting the dots, the ratatouille. So how do we elicit that from her? She had a disease called frontotemporal dementia, which really affects the front of the brain, and we knew that her parietal lobes should be intact. So she should be able to draw, and she was an artist. So we gave her a lot of positive reinforcement, we gave her tools, we encouraged her to do something, and we were so surprised. And you can see the imprint practically of her brain in the pictures that she's painted. Beautiful colors, but you can notice there are so many stars. Those stars indicate the disease. It's called perseveration, where they do the same thing over and over again. But this combination of disability and ability, which the scans kind of pick up and say the frontal lobe has shrunk and the parietal lobe is intact, is something that we could see when we examined her. So clinical neurology is still, we're not dinosaurs. We use simple instruments, but it kind of gives us a lot of insight into the way people are, and also insights into something that is preserved. So what is the reserve that we have in our brains that allows us to function despite the presence of disease? And that is the area of research that everybody is interested in. And what are the factors that build cognitive reserve and may even delay the onset of diseases like dementia, which today don't have a cure. There's no drug that can make them all right. And it's quite well established that education protects, occupational complexity is helpful, complex leisure activities play a big role in delaying dementia onset, and so is physical activity from middle age. But what we found in our study was that the ability to speak more than one language, bilingualism, seemed to have a protective effect. There was some preliminary study from Canada, which is very bilingual, and we kind of derived from those studies, and this is Hyderabad. As I mentioned, we speak 3 or 4 different languages. It's not unusual to walk into a newspaper vendor and pick up 3 papers from 3 different languages, and each of them would have a slightly different slant on the news, local news, national news, and different perspectives, and we can pretty much read at least 2 languages, if not 3. And then this is how we write our grocery list. You can see some things are written in Telugu, some in English, and we are, I remember my groceries in Kannada because I grew up in a place where I used to speak to the grocer in Kannada, but my flowers are in maybe English, my animals maybe in Telugu because that's what I learned. And so we, again, deriving from what Daphna said, she talked about expertise. So we spend time speaking so many different languages that over time it's something that we just take for granted. We are very fluent we have this kind of expertise in languages. So we studied this formally in Hyderabad, and we looked at how people still use languages. And in the intimate areas at homes, we speak a lot of our mother tongue, but we also speak at least 25% of the time. We are kind of speaking other languages. In informal situations where we talk to friends and during leisure, we are mixing up languages a bit more. And while in offices we're sticking to English, we do tend to talk to each other in Hindi or Urdu or Telugu. So this is the pattern of multilingualism in most of India. So this is a clinic. And as clinicians, it's not just the patients or people who are doing the switching. The doctors, we really don't know which patient comes in with which language, and there is flexibility. So she talked about expertise, and then she talked about flexibility. And I think this is something, I realized that both these kind of phenomena are very constantly operating. And to again quote from papers that have worked on bilingualism in normal people, skilled multilinguals rarely make the error of speaking the wrong language, yet they often code switch with other similar multilinguals in the middle of a sentence, suggesting that they possess an enhanced mechanism of cognitive control. So we're able to kind of switch between languages, and there is a control mechanism that seems to operate well, and there are experimental psychology studies that have kind of demonstrated this. So we looked at our dementia registry. Since we have a dementia clinic, we have lots of patients, so we asked, what is the age at onset of monolinguals and multilinguals? And we found that the mean age, the average age at onset of monolinguals was 61 years, but it was 65.6 years among the multilinguals. So multilinguals had a nearly 5-year later age at onset of dementia. And we looked at, again, their cognitive processes. So we have this behavioral measure called the Edinburgh's Cognitive Examination. So you can kind of break up their cognition into attention, memory, fluency, language, and visuospatial functions. And we find that they are doing better on tasks of attention, on memory, fluency, and visuospatial functions. And there seems to be a neural basis for this. There are areas of the brain that are better connected in bilinguals. There's an area called the anterior cingulate gyrus, and then there are certain white matter tracts that connect different parts of the brain together, and those tracts appear to have more structural integrity in bilinguals. So there seems to be some brain basis for this enhanced cognitive processing that happens in bilinguals. But when we look at our bilinguals, it's not so simple because most of them were more educated than the monolinguals. They were often men, and well, they did have a later age onset. Was it all about education then? Was it the fact that they just had more opportunities to interact with people, they studied more? And then we have again, unfortunately, nearly a quarter of our population is still illiterate. None of them has had formal education. So we had a large number of illiterate patients in our group. So we just looked at the illiterates, none of them with education, and we found that bilingualism still appeared to protect against dementia by delaying its age of onset among the bilingual illiterates, which is very interesting because illiteracy is supposed to, all over the world, it's education that protects. So which then took us to what is it about our illiterates, apart from being bilingual, is there anything else that protects them? And you'll hear from Annapurna and from Uzrama that we have a significant proportion of our people are engaged in complex crafts, weaving, pottery, and we had a small number of these people in our study, and we looked at them, and we found that the age at onset with dementia was delayed in those that had engaged in these occupations through their life, weavers or potters, in comparison to those that were illiterate but were doing manual skilled labor. So I'd just like to kind of end. There hasn't much work done on cognition and its relationship to craft and complex motor skills, but there are parallels where there's still parallels only, and there's still very many differences, but the research on music making and brain plasticity is fairly more advanced in the last 2 decades, and there's playing a musical instrument. You don't have to hear the word weaving while I'm saying this, so don't think weaving. Playing a musical instrument is an intense multisensory motor experience. There is evidence that it enhances spatial, verbal, and mathematical abilities. And when you study their brain scans, there are particular white matter tracts, in this case the arcuate fasciculus, which connects the auditory cortex, the hearing cortex, to the motor cortex. The doing cortex is much larger among musicians in comparison to non-musicians. So that's really what I want to say, and we are, just at the beginning of this process, but this is what I'd like to maybe, it's still difficult. I don't think we have answers, but I really like your opinion, Daphna, with your background in cognitive science. So what do we think the cognitive processes are that are engaged by the practice of complex skills? And then a leap of faith. Do these cognitive processes play a role in building cognitive reserve and delaying cognitive and functional decline? And what can the study of learning skills and habits tell us about how cognitive reserve is built? So thank you, Pamela, for this wonderful opportunity. It's been so good to even think about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for Suvarna for this wonderful presentation that really links together weaving and cognition and skills acquisition and the neuroscience and the clinic. So with that, I'd like to open it for a discussion and questions from the audience.
I have a question. I'm curious about the process by which we might become aware of our skilled actions and be able to name certain components of them or have a greater self-awareness of them. And one of the reasons that I'm curious about that is because it seems like that might be one way to start explaining how we're able to substitute or enhance our biological movements with technology. if we're able to name those things, then we can connect it with other knowledge about the world. I'm just curious. I mean, I know that was one of the open questions, so maybe just to hear more about that. Thanks.
Not a lot is known. I mean, the general idea is that we are not good at knowing what we're doing when we're doing things like skills. And there's some data that suggests that in things such as sports, we might start by following instructions, but that as we develop the skill, for real and get better, that at that point, thinking about the labels can actually hinder performance. And so really the consensus has been that consciousness is both not necessary for skill, labeling in that sense is conscious not necessary for skills, but also maybe even gets in the way because it sort of elicits the other system, if you will. I don't think that's, the empirical scientific work on this question is very difficult because it's nearly impossible to prove that something is actually unconscious. So it's been difficult. It's easier to say, does it matter if people are conscious, or to ask people to report and say, well, there's no evidence for conscious awareness, which still isn't the same as saying we know they're not conscious of it. I think that the issue that's been more controversial is on the other side of things, which is how conscious are we of these sort of hippocampal type of mechanisms, where that's where I feel that a lot of that happens outside of conscious awareness too. So I think I share your question. I understand where you're coming from. It seems really important to know kind of at this like metacognitive level, do we know what we're doing? And I don't think we know whether we know what we're doing.
Thank you. With regards to patient HM, did he have any additional newly enhanced skills or skills that he didn't previously have? And then also with regards to Parkinson's patients receiving extra dopamine, it seemed that their learning capabilities were the same as those as the control group. Do you find any additional learning when extra dopamine is administered, or let's say learning is done after exercise when there's an enhanced level of dopamine?
I'll start with a question about dopamine. The general idea is that there's what's referred to as an inverted U-shaped curve relationship between dopamine and various functions, so that if you have too little or too much, that can be bad, and you need just the right amount. So in patients with Parkinson's disease that have this loss of dopamine and you give them dopamine, you're bringing them back to where they needed to be. There are healthy people, there are examples in healthy people where you give people dopamine and they get better at something, but there are many examples where you give people dopamine and they can get worse at something as well. So it's not a simple linear relationship where more dopamine is always good. And as for HM, I don't know of anything he's known to have gotten better at. It's an interesting, there are examples, I think, with dementia, right?
Yeah. Well, it's very true that certain skills get enhanced with certain kinds of diseases. In fact, there's sudden onset of creativity in late life, which was not there before, is now kind of makes us wonder if this person has a disease called frontal dementia. When the front of the brain is getting, kind of shrinking, they get a little disinhibited, and then they express their creativity. So there are people who have had exhibitions in their 50s and 60s of paintings, murals, and I mean there are so many musicians who have created wonderful pieces of music. And just 2 weeks back, we had this teacher who won a national award for innovating a technological system to detect some alarms as an alarm system. After a few years, she developed dementia. So there is, I think, evidence that the brain is trying to compensate and, and then exhibits this spurt of creativity for a brief period before it really starts all degenerating again. And regarding the previous question, this dissociation between naming an action and actually doing it. Again, diseases are a good model to understand the brain, the way it functions in normal. When it's normal, there are people who can perform the action, but they can't name it, and some very rarely vice versa also. So there is a dissociation, I think, between knowing and there are different systems. I agree with Daphna.
Thank you for the talks. They were great. I wanted to ask about the age of the learner, because we all know how a native speaker, there's sort of a window that closes in adolescence. Do you see a difference in when you did this learning?
So there have been some studies. We haven't done this because most of us learn it when we're relatively young. But from United Kingdom and from Scotland, there have been studies where they've looked at people who, and from Wales, people who've learned the language later. And there seems to be evidence that even if you learn it later, there is some cognitive benefit. It's about use, actually. How much you do it and how much you use a second language, that actually provides a lot of benefit. And it's never too late, is what.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that because I'm a language teacher. And I come to this both from weaving and from education. And it seems to me that you've both said in a certain way that repetitive activity is a positive thing, and the ability to use this repetition in many different situations and to be able to do things over time, and also to learn different languages. And it seems to me that our education system, on the other hand, does not at all either give time or acknowledgement in this country to the learning of a second or a third or a fourth language. So in that sense, we also want to address an institution, education, in which we are sitting in Columbia University. How do we make an impact about this? There's a real resistance in this country to being bilingual. So where are we able to impact in which part of anybody's brain these days? So thank you.
I think we should talk about repetition.
I think two things I'd like to say. One is from the scientific, kind of neuroscientific perspective, I think it's important that it's not that something's good or bad. It's that there's a trade-off, and that there are sort of just these biological principles. You know, when I sometimes give talks about the ability to generalize, you know, from one example to something different, some people say, well, that's an error. Some people say that's flexibility, and it's both, right? So I take license to be a little bit agnostic from the mechanisms, from the biological perspectives. I think I share your question, but I think one of the really important insights from what we heard is that I've known about this multilingual, bilingual work for many years. I find it fascinating and really encouraging. I'm raising my children trilingual, for better or for worse. But I think one of the things I learned today is that maybe we shouldn't take language so literally, that skills are a language too. And I think from the education perspective, that's a really important notion of crafts and arts and music and, you know, things that I see, at least in the Upper West Side education my children are getting. There's a lot of that, and it's not just learning artistic expression, but it's actually learning craft and expertise. I think that's absolutely a fascinating connection.
No, I think that Daphna is so, I mean, she's a scientist. And coming from her, I think it makes a lot of difference to hear this, because she's clearly, you know, done the experimental work. And then she made a point about everything is not bad or good. We have a very recent paper 2 weeks back where we kind of, in a group of dementia patients, bilingualism helped those that had a memory loss, a behavioral problem. It did not help people who had a language problem. Yes.
Well, that leads into my question, actually. And I just wanted to, I think these two questions for the two speakers, thank you very much for those wonderful presentations, are related, but I'm not entirely sure. So Daphna, you talked about the striatum as being the area for learning how and the hippocampus for learning what, and this kind of raises my hackles because, of course, that is about that division between mind and hand. And so it might be, in fact, that the connection, how they actually communicate, is the, really important question. And that seemed to be connected, seemed to me to be connected to the question about weavers and potters and bilingualism as creating possibly a cognitive reserve. And so my question is, you talked about many different kinds of dementia, Suvarna, and whether the bilingualism, well, you just said it's not about language, in fact, whether that creates a language cognitive reserve, and maybe you can't actually determine these things in this way, but, and whether the weavers and potters have a different kind of dementia when it comes into being. So if you could just comment on the, mind-hand division.
Yes.
And that's what I meant when I said that our natural scientific language still talks as though there's this division,
Yeah,
and
so,
still models in that way.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation because we should have had it a long time ago, you and I. So my research program started with that same response that you have when my first year in graduate school learned about this division. I not so much from the crafts perspective, but just the idea of a division that made no sense. And so the bulk of my work has been to challenge that, sharing your intuition, but demonstrating, take the basic finding just anatomically, the brain is interconnected. These areas are sharing information, and a lot of the questions I think are about not just the arbitration, but really the integration. How does one source of information talk to the other, given that we have these specialized systems? These are questions we couldn't have asked 10, 20 years ago when we didn't understand each, but I think those are the questions at the forefront right now.
And do you feel confident that this model of learning how, learning what, and it is a simplification, I get it, it's a shorthand, but do you feel confident that this model will endure?
No, I think it's breaking down. So if I were giving, if I had another half hour, we're giving a talk to colleagues in the field of learning and memory, that's what I would have spoken about. So that model really came out of patients like HM, and it's still in the textbooks, and it's sort of an easy characterization. I think that model is, I think there's no question that model is breaking down, and which is exciting. We don't exactly know what the replacement model is. We know it's more complicated, but we know from many studies we can point to sharing of information, one influencing the other, and so forth. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Right. So about potters developing another kind of dementia. I think it's inevitable that a significant proportion of older people develop pathology in the brain, and the brain will degenerate. And there have been wonderful longitudinal studies, in most of them from United States of America. And they've shown us clearly, follow up people over 20 years, 30 years, and track them. And then there's a nun study, there's a religious order study in Chicago, where they have people who've donated their brains after death. And they have pathology in the brain. You look at the brain and it looks Alzheimer's disease. But even a year before, when there were actually detailed clinical evaluations were done, they did not have dementia. So they did not manifest the clinical features of dementia. So there seems to be a dissociation between brain pathology and clinical expression. So that is what we know. It's a small percentage, but it's there. It's not one-to-one. So I was, again, talking to Annapurna about, how do you understand this? I think we're getting insights from people outside the field who are... So there is a brain where pathology is in different parts of the brain. So you have the frontal dementias, you have this dementia, and you have that dementia, they have each. And there's a different brain where their experiences shape their brain. So whether it's musicians, it's this. If it's social, people who are very social, it's not just skills. If you're socially networked, then you have different parts of the brain, and then if you are educated, we don't know still about it, but so there is another brain which is linked on which is built on shaped by your experiences. So you have two different kind of brains, and then you have what Daphna was telling us about where in the brain is all this happening. So where is learning, where is memory, where is visuospatial function? So that's another brain that you have. So I'm just telling you what my sister said. There seem to be three brains, she said, and so we are. Finally, when you live in this world, when you're functional, you're kind of expressing, and you have your genes and all that, you're expressing something that is kind of integrating these three kinds of cognitive functions, your experiences and your genes, and the pathology that develops in a part of the brain. So,
A lot about imaging, but I won't right now.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. I have a question about losing skills after learning them. Because in modern history, we often talk about the skilled artisans in an era of mechanization and industrialization, but I have doubted if being fully de-skilled is ever possible. So could you please just comment briefly on this from a neuroscientific perspective?
I think I share your opinion that skills change. So my relevant anecdote is that other parents often tell me they read or heard that all this technology is changing our children's brains. And is that true? And I say it's absolutely true that it's changing your children's brains, and so is this conversation, and so is what you had for lunch, and right the brain in that sense is agnostic as to what the skill is or what the information is. Mm-hmm. It's adapting to its environment. I think it's the skills change. My daughter can do more on my iPhone than I can. I'm not sure that's the skill I want her to develop more than any, but it might end up being the one that's most relevant, right? It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that they would be learning the skills relevant to their time and not mine. As for, I think, the aspect of unlearning a skill is interesting. There's not been as much research on that as one would like. There's been much more research on questions about unlearning fear responses because of the relevance of that to things like PTSD. The answer from that kind of work is that it's not that you really forget a learned fear response, is that you develop a parallel other response. And so the idea is that that's learning too, and that real forgetting, once something is really learned, you don't really forget it. You can learn something else.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, there will be one more question, and then you can still ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Nori. Hi, so I enjoyed these talks so much. Thank you so much for coming here and giving them. So I'm coming from the humanities, and I realize this may be very naive, but I was really intrigued by this idea of binding the hippocampus and this triangle of navigation, memory, and imagination. And what I wanted to ask about is if there's a way that this is related to the ability for the technique of the memory palace to retain information to be effective. Because what I realized as you were talking about this importance of navigation is that in the memory palace, it's not just about orienting oneself spatially and artificially inserting information like by a bookshelf or under the bed or wherever, but there's a journey that you take. Like you have to go in the front door, you walk up the stairs, you open the bedroom door, you go sit down, and that you need to do all of that. You don't just appear in the room. And so anyway, I wanted to ask if there's a connection happening there, or if I'm just applying what you said to something that I'm think a lot about. Oh, yes. Could you describe it?
Yeah,
you
sure.
describe it better than I would. Yeah.
Okay. The memory palace is a mnemonic trick that people use when they're preparing for memory marathons and competitions. And the idea is that if you have to memorize a list of a pack of cards or a random list of numbers, you memorize them by taking these arbitrary things like the numbers and placing them along the route along a route that's familiar to you. So you would, if you had to memorize, have to help me out here, with something like 7, 13, 12, and Jack, okay, like cards, yes. That you would say, okay, I'm going to put the 7 on my front door. I'm going to take the 12 and put it in the hallway next to my front door. And in fact, ideally, you're doing this in your mind now using the house that you grew up in and not necessarily the house you live in now. And you would place each of these random objects along the route and visualize that And then it would be much easier to recall those numbers than if you were just trying to memorize them by repetition. It's a technique that really works. There's a great book that sort of combines a technique with a personal story with some kind of introspection called Moonwalking with Einstein.
It's a technique that was actually developed in early modern Europe.
Oh, was it? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, it goes back to humanists and to rhetoricians, so it was a way to memorize a speech. Yeah, and many other things.
Yeah, and it's
Anyway, sorry.
so yeah. There is more on the history of this in that book, and it absolutely. I mean, I read it not long ago, this book, and learned about this after I studied memory. It absolutely is perfect from a memory research perspective. It just exploits what the hippocampus does anyway, but kind of forces it to use all of it at once. So it's a very good connection to make. So thank you for bringing that up.
All right, so we'll conclude the first session, and very welcome to stay for the exciting sessions afterwards. So we reconvene in 11.